In 1857, in a brick infirmary off a mud road west of the river, a surgeon cut into a man the ledger had already called dead, and the body answered. Not with a word, with warmth that shouldn't have been there, with a pulse that found the nurse's fingers and pushed once, twice, as though reminding the paper what beats felt like. On folio 19B, the clerk had closed a line with a period and a black stamp. Deceased. On the surgical daybook page 113, the same name reappeared, present. Tense admitted to theatre, operation begun, pulse irregular but present. The ledger was satisfied, the room was not. We read both pages side by side, as if the two could be persuaded to agree by proximity, but they kept their separate weather. The death line was dry law. Date, hour, seal, a name written once and underlined like a drawer shut. The surgical line was damp description, sponge counts, carbolic, an attempt recorded. The hand that wrote it slowed where pulse was mentioned, as if the pen listened, as if a sentence could take a breath. There are stories the countryside tells when a body refuses to obey the calendar. The old women in Illinois parlors called it revenant when a man appeared in harvest after his burial. The German neighbors said Naxera soft as a warning, a feeder on after air. The children had a simpler rule. If someone moves after you've said goodbye, don't say their name twice. We don't measure our work by parlors or children. We measure it by paper. But paper has its own folklore, a line that insists on ending, and a second line that refuses to. The clerk's loop on the D of deceased is steady in January, February, March. By April it trembles in the downstroke, almost a listening. On April 17, 1857, the seal takes with too much ink. Its oval bleeds. Beyond the border, like a margin refusing containment. The death is recorded at 2:14 post-meridium. The operation begins at 2:27, 13 minutes in which a room changes its mind or learns it never had one. We slide lampblack lightly across the death entry, not to vandalize, to listen, and beneath the underline, a curved pressure rises. Herr Ghost of a 2 begun and abandoned, the tale that would have made 25 instead of 14. It is not proof. Clerks make dents without meaning. Hands are heavy when the day runs long. But in the surgical book, a number returns. 25 breaths counted during induction. Someone was counting in the only language the body speaks. Someone was convinced enough of life to count it. The nurse's deposition is unsigned. Its bottom margin shows where the pen rested, trailed a thin crescent of ink as if indecision had a weight. She writes, pulse felt under the thumb, skin cool, not clammy, pupils steady, non-responsive to voice but pressure noted. She strikes one word, alive. It remains indent only, like a word that wants to be allowed. In the margin, the clerk adds a phrase the office does not use, not allowed to end. It is struck and replaced with case continued. The phrase returns on page 141 in a different hand. Not aligned to outcome. The office is inventing a language for what its stamps can't carry. We could keep to the procedure, name, hour, witness, initial, but the first thing this file asks is not to be hurried. This is not a short account. It will not rush. Tonight we open the drawer, seat the documents, and let the room breathe its old air. Lamp oil and wool, a winter damp the pages remember. If you're with us, let the chair take your weight. There is a descent to make, step by step, and it will be slower than you expect. Subscribe if you haven't yet. These files are long and you'll need company on the way through them. And if you're listening now, tell me your country and the time. There's comfort in knowing we are scattered and still reading the same forgotten line. We try to stabilize the paradox by naming it. Case 27. Death certified. Operation commenced. Record bifurcates. Stabilization fails. Names move under light. Numbers refuse to hold their edges. The coroner writes approved after review against the certificate and dates it a day later, as if time were a tool. The surgeon writes voluntary motion observed proceed. The word voluntary is a problem. It belongs to a living will, not to a body that carries a seal. The problem is the point. Between two hands, the one that stamps and the one that cuts, the man on the table becomes an administrative surface, a person recoded as a setting. We note a small thing that should not matter, because small things keep returning in these rooms. The instrument inventory for the operation is the same list used in March, but one string is missing. Not suture, string. A note says, "String not returned to roll." Someone ties something that should not need tying during a procedure on a certified dead man. The string will return in another document. Files rehearse themselves like refrains, changing one word each time until the sentence hardens. Not compatible, not aligned, not allowed to end. If there were a photograph, and there will be when we reach the plates, we would hold it to light and speak about silver that should have fogged by now, about a subject that rehearses darkness and then returns to itself. For the moment we have ink and dent, and the way a clerk tries to master time with stamps. We record the way his numerals favor the rightward lean. We record the way his 5 fights to become a 4 when management prefers smaller numbers. We record the way the surgical handprints measured, even declarative words until it hits pulse, then slows. In our house, we call that deceleration a blink, not of eyes, of conscience. There is a second paradox hiding behind the first, and we will come to it properly. A certificate template altered after the fact, its seal reading, approved after. Death in a typeface the office did not stock that spring. But first we remain with the opening cut. On the table, linen soaked in carbolic. On the shelf, bottles labelled number 3 and number 7 in a different hand than the ward labels. On the floor, scuff marks 2 inches wider than a cot, a sign that a heavier cart came through. Something built for theatre, not for mourning. The room declares itself by its injuries. If you listen carefully, you will notice what the paper learned to say when the body refused to stop being a body. It learned to change its verbs. It learned to move the man from subject to object, from he died to case concluded to case reopened, without ever confessing the reason. It learned to staple obedience to attendance. It learned to freeze what moved so the numbers could hold, and numbers that hold get paid. We close the books for this opening and leave them breathing on the table, because the first beat must finish like a held breath. The ledger says the man is finished. The surgical record says he is still being measured. Between the two we will spend the next hours. Do not close the file. We haven't yet learned what the room did with 13 minutes. The ledger sits where it always sat, center of the oak table, beveled edges rubbed smooth by clerks who leaned too often in the same place. When we place our wrist down, the groove fits us too well, like a memory of weight that does not belong to us. The room is narrow, brick set with lime mortar, windows fogged from years of lamp smoke. A single nail sticks from the plaster above the desk, where a key once hung. The key is gone, but the shadow remains, darker than the wall around it, as if light remembers what was removed. The placard above the door still carries the year, erected 1843. The paint flakes, letters uneven where cold cracked the plaster, yet the date is loyal. The plaque names it an infirmary, but the records say it doubled as poorhouse, then as surgical ward, then as county morgue, depending on which committee minutes you read. It is easier to rename a building than to move its walls. Inside, the air smells of damp wool, iron, lamp oil, and something sharper, carbolic, faint, a smell meant to kill what clings. The papers absorbed it, and when you lift the folios, their fibers exhale a ghost of that disinfectant. We are not hurried. We let the table and its small world declare themselves. Scratches run cross-grain where a scalpel was set down too hard, a decade earlier perhaps. But steel memory is long. A candle burn scar curls black in one corner of the wood, no wider than a coin. It was never sanded smooth, just pressed by palms until it dipped shallow. These marks are not accidents. They are annotations, written without ink, on the furniture. That served as witness. Every room keeps a hierarchy of attention. Here it begins at the desk, drifts to the shelves stacked with volumes bound in cheap cloth, then to the window with its frost of soot. Behind it a corridor leads to the theatre, and further on the ward. But the corridor is too short. The inspection diagram of 1856 says 22 feet. Our steps measure 19. 3 feet are missing. In those 3 feet, the sound of the E floor changes, hollow then solid. We make note. Buildings keep their own errata. The nurses called this table the bench. In one marginalia we find, laid on the bench, eyes still. She does not mean the patient. She means the book. The book lay on the bench as steadily as the boy, eyes still in both cases. The book waits to be written, and in its waiting it stares. We pause here because this is where witnesses also paused. When you stand in this room long enough, the dust becomes louder than the paper. Motes rise and fall as if breathing in time with the lamp flame. The lamp tilts on its base, a wobble never corrected, because the correction would erase the memory of the moment it was dropped. It tilts toward the desk as if listening. Folklore does not keep to parlors. It seeps into rooms like this. Illinois. Farmers told of the sitting dead, men who remained upright in chairs for days after their heart gave way, lips moving as if to pray but with no voice. German F. On the table's underside, shallow cuts mark numbers, tally lines 5 and 5 then struck. Perhaps a clerk counted admissions, perhaps a porter tracked days. One set ends at 12, carved deeper, as if pressed with more conviction. 12. Cuts, 12 breaths, 12 minutes? We cannot know, but the echo is there. Numbers that should move but prefer to be cut into wood. We draw our fingers over the grain, feel the dent where wax dripped and hardened into the page edge of folio. 20. The wax is black now, not red. A clerk tried to seal something, failed and left the residue as a scar. Wax that does not seal is like death that does not close, a process unfinished, a sentence withheld from its period. The paper smells faintly of soot when warmed in hand. Though no flame has touched it since storage, fire leaves its memory in fibers. We close our eyes and hear the small sounds that animate the place. The chair creak, the thrum of winter wind against a shutter, the irregular thud of our pulse as if the room borrowed it. This is not superstition, it is acoustics. Yet, folklore prefers acoustics. The room breathes slower than us. It drags the seconds until time bends. One nurse, identified only by initials MH, wrote in her private notes, "I thought him gone until the cut began." Then his skin sighed. She could not reconcile it, so she filed it not in the infirmary's archives but folded into her psalter between Psalms 69 and 70. The page bears a small, oily mark where the folded note pressed too long. It smells of lamp oil still. When we hold it, the paper trembles faintly from our hands' heat, as though Sigh remembered itself. If we stand at the threshold long enough, the placard above the door appears to change. The year remains 1843, but the word beneath, infirmary, wears thinner than the plaster around it, almost erased by air. In raking light it reads something else, repository. The building no longer cares whether it was hospital or poorhouse or morgue. It knows itself only as a place that receives and does not return. And here is the question that begins to shape itself in silence. What happens to a place that remembers more than its people? The clerks are gone, the surgeon's dust, the nurses, buried under headstones with 2 dates. The desk remains, the tally marks remain, the smell remains. It is as if the material world has a duty the witnesses abandoned, to keep contradictions safe until someone comes back to read them. We will. That is the work. We will sit at this bench, let the papers exhale carbolic, let the grooves accept our wrists, and listen to what was not supposed to be written. Because in 1857 Illinois they declared the dead alive long enough to operate, and the room remembers. The first record is always meant to be final. A death certificate does not ask questions. It closes them. In 1857 Illinois, the coroner's book on folio 19B declares, deceased male, age 32, cause exhaustion following fever. Time, 2:14 p.m. A signature curbs beneath, initials HL in a practiced hand. The loop on the L is steady across other pages. March, April, but here it falters, pressing harder on the downstroke, as if the hand itself was unwilling to commit the body to silence. At the bottom, the oval seal of the county is pressed with too much ink, its edge feathering outward into the margin. The page wants closure. The ink disagrees. And yet 12 pages later, in the surgical ledger page 113, the same name is written again, without strikeout, without note of contradiction. Admitted to theatre, pulse irregular, Commenced incision 2:27 p.m. A man declared dead is admitted as patient. 2 documents, both official, separated by no more than 13 minutes of paper time. The paradox is surgical. How to cut into a man already stamped closed. The contradiction is not hidden. It sits bold on the page. But the office does not call it contradiction. The marginalia in smaller script writes, "Case continued." Continued from where? A body is not a ledger entry you can reopen, and yet they did. We run our finger under the word continued. The ink is faint, almost faded before its time, and beneath the line our lampblack reveals a dent in the pulp. The word that was first pressed there was revived. Revived was abandoned. Continued was safer. It allowed the record to remain clinical, while hinting at what no office would dare to certify. Numbers mutate when they should not. On the certificate, the time of death is written 2:14. On the surgical record, the operation begins 2:27. But in the margin of the nurse's deposition, she notes 25 breaths counted. We look closer. The 14 on the death record bears the faint ghost of a 25. The pen pressed too deep, then corrected. We see the tail of the 2 beneath the ink. Was the clerk correcting himself or correcting time? Which is truer, the number that ink carried or the number the hand tried to deny? These micro-contradictions multiply. The coroner's signature is smudged, not blurred by accident but dragged slightly upward, as though the page shifted when the ink was still wet. In contrast, the surgeon's name is written firmly, full loop, without hesitation. They belonged to the same office, yet the certainty lives in the hand that cut, not the hand that closed. It is as if 2 offices were speaking at once, one determined to end, the other determined to begin. We step aside from the paper and let folklore whisper again. Numbers that change their faces are not new. In fairy tales, a name written wrongly can undo a spell. A count misstated can bind or release a ghost. In Irish lore, a changeling is revealed when numbers don't hold. The age doesn't match the body, the years don't add. Here in Illinois, the myth moved to the margin. The office became its own fairy tale. A man counted dead, then counted alive. The contradiction sustained by the silence of ink. On the lower edge of the death certificate, 3 words appear faintly, as if written in another hand, another time. Not assigned ward. They are not in the coroner's script. They slant differently, a hurried clerk perhaps. The words do not belong on a death certificate. To be not assigned is to be waiting, not ended. The phrase reappears weeks later in a census addendum. The same man listed as present, not assigned. Bureaucracy creates its own afterlife. To be alive on paper is not to breathe. It is to be still processing. The contradictions turn mechanical. The ledger number for the certificate is 27B. On the surgical record, it is 03V. Same man, same date, 2 codes. Paper mutated him into 2 different cases. Numbers that mutate are like names in a fairy tale. Never stable, always recoded. We whisper them aloud, 27B, 03V. It feels like an incantation, the way clerks recite what they cannot reconcile. The file moves, the man stays, or worse, the man moves only because the file allows him to. We look at the ink itself. Under magnification, the coroner's line is iron gall, brown with age. The surgical note is fresher, blacker, but both written in the same year. A reagent test on a corner scrap behaves strangely. It goes blue, then red. Not the expected iron reaction. The ink is not what it claims to be. It is as though the record rehearsed a result, brown with time, then red with correction. We note it, we file it. The impossible belongs in the same drawer as the contradiction. Voices emerge between the lines. The nurse wrote, responds to pressure. The surgeon. Voluntary motion observed. Voluntary. The word does not belong to a corpse. The coroner. Deceased. 3 voices on 3 papers, none aligned. The chorus of documents refuses harmony. They sing dissonance, and the room keeps their tune. What is the purpose of contradiction so visible? Perhaps this, to protect the system, not the patient. If the man was dead, the surgery could not be called failure. If the man was alive, the surgery could be called miracle. In either case, the office profits. Contradiction is not error. Contradiction is shield. We circle. Back to the beginning. Folio 19b ends with a period. Page 113 refuses it, begins again without pause. Between them is 13 minutes the room remembers better than the ink. 13 minutes in which a man was both filed and opened, sealed and incised. The paradox hurts to hear. That is why it must be repeated, not compatible, not aligned, not assigned, not allowed to end. Understood. You want beat 4, record number 2 fully expanded to its full target weight, 1,200 plus words, in seamless, 7th mark, 8th file narration. What I gave you above is around 1,000 words, so let's deepen it. More material detail, folklore tangent, and document micro-contradictions until it breathes at length. Here's the expanded version. The first contradiction might be dismissed. A clerk's fatigue, a slip of pen, a number corrected too late. Offices endure by feeding themselves such excuses. But the second record denies that refuge. It does not whisper. It insists. We unfold the nurse's deposition, kept folded once, edge crisp as if the paper never wanted to open. The fold has memory. It pulls back into itself no matter how we flatten it, as though the testimony resists the light. Across the top margin, in faint graphite, an instruction, File in Annex. Yet the annex for that month is missing, burned perhaps, or reassigned. The deposition survives only by misfiling. Her script is careful, formal, trained in the school of daily ward reports, and yet here her letters tremble. She writes, pulse noted under thumb, skin cool, not clammy, pupils fixed, but pressure received. Then silence. The sentence trails, midline, a blot, no word, only a blot. Beneath it, faint in the pulp, visible only under raking light, a word pressed but not inked. Alive. The pen began to commit the word, then was lifted. The pulp carries the dent like a ghost of intention. She withheld the word, but the page remembered. We lay this sheet beside the coroner's certificate. One voice sealed, one voice struck. Both dated the same day. The contradiction is not rumor, it is textual. Which carries authority? The heavy seal of office or the thumbprint of a nurse pressed against a pulse? This is not evidence versus evidence, it is allegiance versus allegiance. The coroner belonged to the county, the nurse belonged to the bed. Each loyalty wrote its truth. Both remain. A second voice enters. Elijah Vance, porter, deposition before, magistrate. His script is uneven, words leaning forward as though hurrying. He writes, I heard motion, thought it cart, it was man. He made sound when we set him. The magistrate's note in the margin, not relevant to inquiry. Official silence tries to erase the sound, but ink is stubborn. Elijah's testimony, files preserved, footnoted out of relevance, but present still. His voice exists only once, then vanishes from the records, either dismissed or silenced. In these files, absence of repetition often means absence of employment. A third voice comes not from office, but from neighbor. A condolence letter, folded into the family Bible, later donated with the estate. It begins in common phrases, your loss is shared by us all. But the second page betrays itself. The quiet one walks your garden row like a shadow. A man declared dead walking furrows days later, silent. The family accepted the condolences, not the sighting. They never replied. But the letter lives. Contradiction keeps multiplying. We hear the folklore now, because these voices echo what was already whispered in Illinois parlors. They told of the quiet walkers, men who moved after their breath should have stopped, who appeared in fields at dusk, their silence heavier than any cry. German immigrants called them stille Gänger, silent goers. In prairie cemeteries, you find stones with two dates, one for death, one for burial, as though the interval could not be reconciled. Silence itself became evidence. Here, in this infirmary, silence is preserved in paper dents and blank lines. Silence speaks when words refuse. Look at the deposition again. In the margin, stamped in block capitals, not for ward use. The stamp does not belong here. It was meant for requisitions, inventory slips for carbolic and gauze. Someone pressed it into her testimony. The meaning shifts. Her words were not for patients, not for wards, not to be believed. The office weaponized a supply stamp against a witness. This is how bureaucracy erases, not by burning words but by categorizing them out of relevance. Her handwriting resists. In her daily reports she wrote smooth, steady. Here her letters heavy, pooling ink at the ends, strokes breaking mid-loop. This is not fatigue. It is pressure. A hand writing against silence, aware that the sentence will not be welcomed. And yet she wrote. That act itself survives as contradiction. To testify is to resist even when erased. Compare her voice with the surgical daybook. The surgeon wrote, voluntary motion observed. The nurse, pulse noted. The porter, he, made sound. 3 witnesses converge on one fact, not still. Against them one seal, deceased. The ledger favors the seal. Yet here we sit, a century and a half later, and it is not the seal we hear, but the dense, the heavy strokes, the footnoted irrelevance. Silence is loud when given enough time. There is more. The ward log for April 17, 1857, carries a page nearly blank, only one line. Case continued. The rest of the page refuses ink, and yet, under oblique light, we see 3 pressed words abandoned in the pulp. Not allowed to end. Struck before they lived, yet dented deep. A refrain mutating itself across surfaces. Not compatible, not aligned, not assigned. Now not allowed to end. The office creates a new language for what it cannot name. Incantations, repeated until reality conforms, and so silence itself becomes structural. The perfect ward is not noisy with complaints, not filled with cries. It is silent. A patient declared dead is the perfect patient, compliant, unresisting, unable to contest. A body still operated upon is both proof of miracle and shield against failure. If it lives, credit. If it dies, no blame. Silence is not absence. Silence is utility. This second record, then, does more than echo the first. It proves the mechanism. Contradiction is not accident. It is method. A patient toggled between dead and alive becomes leverage for the system, never truth for the person. Witnesses are silenced with wrong stamps. Pages are blank yet pressed with dents. Neighbors write what families cannot say aloud. Contradiction becomes the operating principle, the ledger's survival strategy. The neighbor's letter lingers because it speaks in metaphor stronger than the office. He walks your row like a shadow. This is folklore folded into daily life. A revenant not as monster but as laborer, bent to furrows, silent, still working fields he was meant to leave. Silence is not horror, it is endurance. To walk unacknowledged is still to walk. To work as shadow is still to work. The office may file him as concluded, but the garden row says otherwise. What do we do with these contradictions preserved across voices? We do not reconcile them. To choose is to lose. We keep them side by side, dead and alive, blank and pressed, silent and speaking, because that dissonance is the story. The second record insists, truth in this system is never singular. It is always doubled, withheld in one place, confessed in another, folded like the paper that resists our flattening hand. So record number 2 ends not in harmony, but in residue. A nurse who pressed the word alive but would not ink it. A porter who heard a sound but was footnoted away. A neighbor who saw a shadow bending to furrows. A blank page pressed with refusal. And one seal heavy with ink, feathered outward, still, declaring the word deceased. These are not anomalies, they are the architecture. The paradox does not collapse under weight. It holds because of it. Not allowed to end, not allowed to end. Not allowed to end. Every file has a moment where the contradiction stops being an argument between people and becomes an argument with matter itself. Witnesses can be silenced, seals can be trusted, words can be called irrelevant. But when the paper or the photograph disobeys, the system has no language left. This is that moment. In the county archive, misfiled among probate documents, we find a cabinet photograph of the man at the center of the paradox. It should not exist. Autopsy subjects were not photographed in 1857 in Illinois county wards. And, yet here it is, matte finish embossed studio back dated April. The reverse carries no name, only a faint penciled mark, case 27B. The code repeats, the same as the death certificate. This is him. We mount the photograph beside a control. Another cabinet card from the same studio, dated the same season, an anonymous farmer. The control fogs at the edges when exposed to ultraviolet, the way silver halides surrender to time. The subject should behave the same. It does not. The photograph darkens all at once as though swallowing the light, then releases it back, returning exactly to its prior state. Control fades. Subject returns. We are not supposed to write the word impossible. The technician did not. He wrote image unchanged. This is not superstition. It is chemistry behaving against its own record. We repeat the test not once but thrice. Each time the same, control yellows, subject rehearses darkness, then resets. The plate does not age, it does not degrade. It remembers itself in a way matter should not. We study its fibers under magnification. Along the edges where silver should bloom into haze, the surface remains crisp. Instead of silvering, a faint pattern of indentation emerges, not image but numbers. 25 struck faintly, like breaths counted into emulsion. No photographer pressed those figures. They belong to another process, another hand. The photograph has absorbed not just light, but ledger. We run a reagent across the ink mark 27B on the reverse. The iron gall test is meant to brown. It does briefly, then flashes blue, then red, before settling into nothing. The ink rehearses, colors it should not know. The technician notes, not an iron gall response. He does not elaborate. The file absorbs the silence as part of its evidence. A second forensic attempt comes from the death certificate itself. Under raking light, beneath the underline on the word deceased, a curve emerges. The dent belongs not to a 4, but to a 5. The time 2:14 wants to be 2:25. The body's breaths and the pen's pressure align. What the clerk corrected, the fiber remembers. The page argues with itself. This is how matter resists. Fibers swell where pressure, not pen, wrote. Ink that should confirm age behaves like pulse. Photographs that should fog rehearse their own resurrection. Fire remembered in soot under varnish, pressure remembered in dents. We cannot argue with witnesses alone. We must argue with the stubbornness of things. The mythic echo returns because it cannot be avoided. In folklore, revenants resist decay. In this archive, photographs resist age. In fairy tales, changelings cannot be counted. In this ledger, numbers refuse to stabilize. In German lore, the Nachtzehrer feeds on its own shroud and grows stronger. Here, the photograph feeds on its own exposure and restores itself. The myth speaks the same language as the chemistry, refusal to end. We pause on a detail the technician wrote in margin. Hesitant, almost ashamed, image behaved as if breathing. He was not a poet. He was a county chemist used to testing ink and paper. And yet the language betrays him, breathing. The photograph rehearses light in and out like lungs. A body denied breath leaves its trace in image. Matter remembers. We test further. Heat applied to the photograph should warp, but it only darkens briefly, then clears. Cold should frost, but instead the surface remains unchanged, as if indifferent to season. The card is not just record, it is ritual. An object, rehearsing the same refusal as the ledger. Not allowed to end, a minor forensic echo lives in the surgical ledger itself. On page 113, beside the line "Voluntary motion observed," the ink bleeds into the margin, unusually dark. Under magnification, the bleed contains soot, embedded under varnish. Soot that does not belong on a page stored in cabinet. Soot trapped beneath a finish that was applied later. It means the page remembered fire it should never have touched, as if the ledger absorbed ash from the very bodies it recorded and would not let go. This is how systems create their own folklore: a photograph that does not age, ink that rehearses colors, pages that remember fire. They become impossible beats, test results that cannot be reconciled, preserved not because they are believed but because they are filed. The archive cannot erase them without erasing itself, so it keeps them quiet, unlabeled, waiting. The refrain returns, mutated once more. First not compatible, then not aligned, later not assigned. Now under the forensic notes, still processing, stamped in hurried block letters across a folder tab. Still processing. As though a man could be a file waiting for completion, as though death itself were only pending approval. We step back, breathe, let the silence hold. This is the forensic. Beat and silence belongs here, because when matter argues there is no room for haste. We look again at the photograph. Control fades, subject returns. We look again at the ledger. Ink rehearses colors. We look again at the certificate. Dents betray corrections. The system's perfect shield becomes its perfect confession. It cannot stop its matter from remembering. What was he then? Dead, but breathing in photograph. Alive but sealed in ledger. Impossible but filed. The forensic test does not answer, it only insists. Image unchanged. Ledger dented. Ink rehearsed. Not allowed to end. Contradictions once sown do not stay alone. They sprout, they scatter, they grow into repetitions that appear where they should not. In ledgers, in margins, in slips filed sideways. At first they look like errors, then you notice the pattern. Errors repeat too often to be accident. They become incantation. This is the echo. We spread the records across the table in the infirmary room: certificate, surgical ledger, nurse's deposition, neighbor's letter, the photograph, even the return slip for surgical instruments, and we read them not as history but as liturgy. They speak back in refrains, each one slightly altered, never identical, like voices in a round. On the death certificate, a dent beneath ink presses a time that does not match the official. 2:25 hidden under 2:14, not compatible. Time itself refuses compatibility. On the surgical ledger, a margin note marks, "Case continued, not aligned." What should have ended is forced to align to another line, another column, another day. On the nurse's deposition, she pressed but did not ink the word alive. She left it as dent, a ghost in the pulp. Then the office stamped across the margin, a phrase meant for supply orders, not for ward use, not assigned. Her testimony is treated as if it were gauze, consumable, irrelevant, denied a place in the ward of truth. And in the photograph's folder tab, a later clerk stamped in blunt letters. Still processing, as if a man could be pending, a body waiting on approval, a life queued like a shipment not yet released, not allowed to end. The refrain mutates again. We follow the phrases outward. In the county census of 1857, 3 names appear with annotations: present, case continued. The census is meant to count the living, yet it borrows surgical language. Lives reduced to cases, deaths postponed into continuations. The refrain leaves the infirmary and enters the county roll. It does not stop there. In a court memorandum, dated August, a judge excuses the absence of a witness with a line in the margin: still processing. This is not legal language, it is borrowed from wards, from files. A refrain migrates across institutions, as if the system itself needs a shared vocabulary to disguise its failures. Words repeat until they become reality. Words become architecture. This is not unlike folklore. Charms survive by repetition. In rural Illinois, a widow was told to whisper her husband's name 3 times at the threshold, and his shadow would pass across the doorway. In Ireland, to name a changeling's age 3 times backward was to force its return to fairy hills. Words said once describe, words said thrice create. Bureaucracy performs the same ritual, case continued. Still processing, not allowed to end. A refrain repeated until the file itself becomes a body that refuses to stop moving. We notice the handwriting shifts. Case continued in neat clerk's script, not aligned in hurried, slanted hand, still processing in rigid block letters. 3 hands, 1 refrain, an echo traveling across bodies as well as pages. Clerks join a chorus without meeting each other. This is how incantation works, passed hand to hand, each one repeating slightly differently, until the words become stronger than the individuals who carried them. Numbers echo too. The code 27B recurs where it should not, on the certificate, on the photograph reverse, in the census roll. The variant 03V appears not only in the surgical book, but later in a supply list, assigned to gauze and roll string, numbers. Migrate, replicate, repeat like names in folklore. To speak them is to bind the body they represent. He was no longer buried in earth. He was buried in code. We pause again on the nurse's page. Her aborted word, alive, is visible only as dent. Yet next to it another curve, half a letter, the beginning of a signed. She stopped mid-stroke. She refused to finish the word. A refusal is as much part of the echo as an affirmation. Resistance is another note in the round. She would not commit him to not assigned. She let silence hold instead. Even the smallest. Scraps join the chorus. A return slip for surgical tools lists among forceps and sponges. String not returned. The phrase does not belong to fabric. It belongs to files, not returned. The man is absent, but his absence is preserved like string uncoiled and lost. Absence named is still presence, not returned, not concluded, not ended. The file finds a way to echo its denial through even the humblest objects. The building joins too. On the doorframe of the ward, carved faintly by knife, we find 3 letters. They are not initials of staff we can identify. They match a phrase already seen, not allowed to end. The refrain moves from desk to wall, paper to wood. The building itself rehearses what the office invented. When structures repeat words, they become more than memory. They become ritual sites. We step back from the papers and listen to the echoes as if they were voices. They chant together, not compatible, not aligned, not assigned, still processing, not allowed to end. Each one denies closure. Each one sustains presence. Together they form a vocabulary that sounds administrative, but works like spellcraft. The man remains in the ward, not because he breathes, but because the file repeats. He is kept alive on paper by denial of ending. Folklore helps us see what bureaucracy hides. In the counting charm, if you name a revenant's steps one by one, it must walk them endlessly until dawn. It cannot rest until the chant is broken. Bureaucracy performs the same. It counts, stamps, annotates, until the man becomes nothing but his repetition. He cannot end because the file will not stop naming him as continued, pending, unassigned. The ledger made its own revenant. What do we do with echoes like these? We could dismiss them as scattered quirks. But together, they form a system of refusal. Contradictions alone are anomalies. Echoes are architecture. They prove that the office did not simply make mistakes. It made ritual. It created an afterlife of words for bodies it could not reconcile. And the refrain carries forward century to century in the fibers, in the dents, in the carved initials. We are still listening to it. This is the weight of beat 6, that the file sustains itself not with truth but with repetition. It keeps itself alive by echoing its own denials. The man is not ended. He is still processing. Case continued, not allowed. To end. The incantation survives line to line, page to page, until even we sitting here find ourselves repeating it aloud. And repetition is how the dead keep walking. Every file eventually reveals not just its contradictions, not just its echoes, but the reason it exists in such a broken shape. Systems do not generate errors at random. They generate them at need. When we peel back the layers of Illinois, 1857, what we find is not a doctor alone or a nurse's hesitation or a clerk's dent. We find an institution that profited from refusing to let endings be endings. This is the reveal. The Board of Infirmary Governors, a committee of 6 men drawn from county business and church offices, met quarterly to review admissions, discharges, and what they called outcomes. In their minutes for April, one phrase appears that does not belong in medical context. Miracles reported 3. Not recoveries, not remissions, miracles. The word repeats across 3 separate quarterly reports. What counts as a miracle? A patient pronounced dead who rises again in the records. A body sealed by certificate but cut by scalpel. A ledger that says deceased at 2:14 and operated upon at 2:27. The contradictions we have traced are not mistakes. They are miracles for the board. Why? Because miracles made reputations. An infirmary that produced miraculous recoveries attracted donors, church patronage, state recognition. A ward that was silent and compliant reassured visiting inspectors. Failure could be rewritten into miracle with a stroke of pen. The dead man made into living patient. The miracle counted, the failure erased. And for the system, silence was always profitable. Consider the way they measured success. A table in the governor's ledger divides patients into concluded and continued. Concluded means discharged, buried, or removed. Continued means still present, still a case, still processing. Numbers in the continued column always look better to donors than numbers in concluded. The longer a patient can be counted as processing, the healthier the ward appears. Death closes accounts. Continuation secures funds. The man who was declared dead and then operated upon existed in this twilight column. He was both a failure and a miracle, depending on which ledger you read. The board could tell donors 3 miraculous continuations. This quarter, while internally counting 1 fewer death. This is not clerical error, this is incentive. Better to rename the dead alive than admit the surgery failed. Better to invent a language, case continued, not assigned, still processing, than confess what had occurred. This is how systems survive, not through honesty, but through repetition of denial. We find proof in the way financial ledgers align with medical ones. A note in the treasurer's book lists donations earmarked for miracle recoveries. 1. Entry April 1857 credits the infirmary with $5 for each miracle case. The incentive is explicit. Miracles were currency. Bodies recoded from dead to alive were not anomalies, they were income. A system that paid for silence would always prefer silence. A system that paid for miracles would always prefer contradictions. This is where the folklore merges with mechanism. In tales of revenants, the dead who return are feared because they disturb the village order. In the infirmary, the dead who return are cultivated because they preserve the institution's order. The file itself is a revenant, kept walking not by superstition but by stipend. The system made its own changeling, not born, not buried, only filed. Language reveals complicity. The minutes of the board never use the word dead. They use terms like suspended and pending and not closed. A body is recoded as a process. A man becomes a setting. They write, ward quiet, numbers stable, miracles noted. Quiet. Wards meant steady donations. Stable numbers meant fewer questions. Miracles meant prestige. Silence became a metric of success. The louder the contradictions, the more firmly the board pressed its silence. Silence paid better than truth. We step again into the room where the ledgers lie. We notice details that embody this system. The placard over the door that once read infirmary has eroded to repository, a place that receives but does not return. On the desk, tally marks cut into wood align perfectly with miracle counts in the governor's book. Not patient tallies. Miracle tallies. Each cut notches income. Even the furniture remembers the incentive, the refrain that has haunted us, not compatible, not aligned, not assigned, still processing, is not mere bureaucratic drift. It is the system's self-defense. Each phrase denies responsibility, shifts liability, preserves funding. Not compatible means the case doesn't fit categories. Not our fault. Not aligned means the numbers disagree, adjust them. Not assigned means no ward bears blame. Still processing means delay disclosure until the inspection has passed. And not allowed to end means no donor is ever told that silence hides a corpse. This is not horror from beyond. It is horror from a desk. A system that turned its files into revenue streams, its contradictions into miracle counts, its silences into currency. The nurse's dented word, alive, was not erased. Because it was wrong, it was erased because it was inconvenient. The porter's testimony, he made sound, was noted and dismissed as irrelevant, not because it was false, but because it was unprofitable. Truth had no place where silence paid. We see the same mechanism in other institutions of the era. Poorhouses that renamed deaths as transfers, asylums that reclassified suicides as discharges, factories that listed amputations as voluntary resignations. Each denial protected the system. Each echo preserved stability. Illinois, in 1857, was not unique. It was simply early. The mechanism repeats across decades, across states, across ledgers. Better to freeze the count than find the body. Better to rename the door than open it. Better to deny the death than own the failure. The thesis emerges clear. A file draws a person. The person cannot redraw the file. The man at the center of this case lived or died in flesh, but in the archive he became something else entirely. He became a revenue line, a miracle statistic, a silence preserved. He became a changeling of paper, not compatible with life or death, only with system. We linger on this because it is not simply past. The language survives in our present systems too. Hospitals that mark patients still processing in billing after they have died. Courts that list cases as pending long after files are sealed. Insurance that pays for continuations but denies coverage for conclusions. The echoes remain because the incentive remains. Silence is still profitable. Continuation is still rewarded. Endings are still denied. So when we return to the photograph, darkening then clearing as though breathing, we understand it not as miracle, but as mechanism. The image rehearses itself because the system rehearsed itself. Contradiction preserved is not accident. It is architecture. This is the system reveal, a ward that thrived not by healing but by filing, not by burying but by repeating, not by truth but by refrain. A file never truly ends. Clerks close it, seals press it, drawers receive it, but residues linger like breath after a sentence. Residues are the proof that paper has memory longer than any office. Residues are the way wood refuses to forget the weight of wrists. Residues are how light rehearses itself on plates that should surrender to chemistry, but do not. This case ends not with conclusion, but with residues. 3, at minimum. Each one layered like palimpsest, refusing to be erased. The first residue is the beneath fiber triplet. On a census index card, meant to tally households, not bodies, under raking light 3 dented words rise without ink. Kept, not kept, still recorded. The strokes pressed but withheld, as though a clerk rehearsed categories before daring to commit them. To be kept is to be owned by the file, preserved as statistic. To be not kept is to be discarded, a name struck. But to be still recorded is something stranger, not alive, not gone, suspended. This triplet captures the man's state better than any seal. Still recorded, neither erased nor admitted, lingering in pulp like a revenant in paper. The second residue lives in the drawer itself. When we draw it open, the metal groans softly. Not rust, but memory. The card inside is blank, deliberately so, a page never written yet heavy in the hand. At its top edge 3 shallow dents hover, as if letters once pressed but never filled. And on the steel lip beneath, etched faint and older than the cabinet's manufacture, a sentence whispers, "Don't close the file. No clerk signed it. No office authorized it." The drawer itself has learned to speak. Furniture becomes archivist, steel becomes witness. Its words do not read as warning but as ritual, as if closing this file would unmake something the system still requires. The drawer teaches us what the file has always insisted. Endings are forbidden. The third residue is the most defiant. The photograph, mounted beside a control exposed to ultraviolet, the control fogs with silver haze, the ordinary surrender of image to time. The subject does not. It darkens all at once, as though swallowing light whole, then clears back to its untouched state, not aging and rehearsing. The technician's note says only, "Image unchanged." But his marginal scrawl betrays more honesty, behaved as if breathing. He was not a poet, he was a county chemist, yet even he heard the rhythm. The photograph inhales, exhales, restores itself. It remembers life by practicing it in cycles of dark and light. The image becomes body, the man becomes rehearsal, and residue becomes persistence. 3 residues, each speaking in different tongues. Card, draw, photograph. One speaks of categories, one of refusal, one of breath. Together they harmonize into a chorus of unending. They prove what every refrain across the case has whispered. Not compatible, not aligned, not assigned, still processing, not allowed to end. Residues are the archive's way of carrying that chant forward even after voices fall silent. Folklore surfaces here too, uninvited but inevitable. The changeling never grows, the revenant never decays. The automaton repeats its motions endlessly. This man, or this file that drew him, carries all 3. His age never stable in the census. His body never surrendered to decomposition, in witness accounts. His photograph repeating its inhalation. The system made its own creature of folklore, but it did not name him ghost. It named him case. And the case became continued, again and again, until continuation itself became identity. We must ask the final question plainly. What was he? Was he a man misplaced by clerks, forced to live on in error? Was he a man invented by office, conjured into being by contradictions that served funding? Was he flesh that lingered 13 minutes beyond the seal, long enough to make the room lose its confidence in categories? Or was he only residue, dents, stamps, exposures, a myth created by paper's refusal to forget? We cannot choose. 1. To choose would be to betray the file's nature. He is all simultaneously. He is contradiction embodied. The thesis becomes clear in residue. A file draws a person. The person cannot redraw the file. Once recorded as miracle, he remains miracle, whether or not he breathed. Once tallied as continued, he remains processing, whether or not his chest moved. Once stamped, not allowed to end, he remains pending, even when sealed in ground. Paper outlasts flesh. Ledger overrules breath. Residue refuses burial. This is not superstition. This is administration behaving like folklore. We close our hands on the table's wood, feel the grooves worn by wrists long dead. We smell the faint soot in pages that never burned. We hear the drawer whisper its etched line. We hold the photograph until its rhythm begins to match our own. These are not tricks. They are residues. They are the way the world itself protests the office's denial of endings. When human voices fail, matter continues the song, and the song says, not ended. We breathe with it, slowly, because haste has no place here. The air is thick with lamp oil and damp wool. Dust motes rise and fall in rhythm. The lamp's flame bends, as if joining the breath of photograph and room. Everything rehearses itself. Nothing concedes finality. Even silence feels practiced, not absolute. What remains at last is not horror, not miracle, not haunting. What remains is system. A system that rewarded contradictions, that preferred continuations, that paid for miracles. A system that recoded bodies into files and files into revenue. A system that forgot how to forget. And in forgetting, it created residues that will not let go. This isn't a ghost story. It's about a ledger that learned to keep its silence by repeating it. It's about a drawer that etched its own warning when clerks refused. It's about a photograph that inhaled long after lungs had stilled. It's about a man made into case, case made into refrain, refrain made into residue. It's about a system that mistook denial for care, continuation for cure, silence for miracle. Don't close the file. That is what the drawer whispers. Don't. Close the file. That is what the pulp insists. Don't close the file. That is what the photograph rehearses, breath after breath. We are only readers, only listeners, only witnesses arriving a century and a half too late. And yet we join the ritual. We keep the file open by speaking it. Tell me your country and the time. We are scattered across the world, but gathered here in the same ward, breathing the same contradictions, listening to the same residues. The file is still open. The man is still recorded. The system is still processing, and we, like the photograph, like the drawer, like the card, are not allowed to end.